miners, activist entertainers, and Spanish painters. All that and more on this bonus episode of Our Fake History. Roll the bonus theme. Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of Our Fake History. My name's Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where normally we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. But on these bonus episodes, I like to take questions from the beautiful human beings who listen to this podcast, and I do my best to answer them as thoughtfully as I possibly can. Now, as you'll hear, many of these questions come to us through Patreon. One of the perks of being a patron is that you get access to the Patreon community and our Patreon chats. I'm always looking at those Patreon chats to see what questions folks have. But other listeners can send me emails as well. Honestly, I love hearing from all of you. The community around this podcast is really what sustains me. And these bonus episodes have really become a lovely way to connect with all of you. I just got a lot of love for you, and I love hearing from you. So never hesitate to reach out, by the way. I love getting an email. I love just hearing about your lives. It kind of fills me up when I'm making this show. I make the show entirely by myself. And so it's nice to know that there's a community out there that's listening and that cares about it. So never hesitate to reach out. I love hearing from you. Today, we're going to be answering questions that have to do with the last two Our Fake History episodes, episode 247 that was on Henry Box Brown, and episode 248, which was on the question of whether or not there was a real Snow White. When I was planning these episodes, I realized that one was a bit more of a curveball, while the other was just a fastball right down the center of the plate. Here's what I mean. The Snow White episode, I think, is classic Our Fake History. If you've been following this podcast for a while, then you know that that's the type of topic that we have been exploring since the very first season. Is there a kernel of real history hidden inside a famous folktale? That's kind of what we do here. Now, the story of Henry Box Brown, on the other hand, took a little bit more creative thinking to sort of fit it within the parameters of what this show is. But the reason I stuck with it was, one, I became fascinated by the autobiography of Henry Box Brown, and two, there was something about his life that reminded me of many other figures that we've explored on this show. Specifically, I found myself thinking a lot about Buffalo Bill Cody, who we explored earlier this season. Both Buffalo Bill and Henry Box Brown took real events from their life and turned them into theater. Now, I didn't bring this up on the Henry Box Brown show because it was kind of a loose idea, but I think both of these people were showmen at heart. However, you might remember I was critical of Buffalo Bill's decision to live theatrically and do violent and dramatic things in real life just so he could create better theater back on the stages of the East. Henry Box Brown never did anything quite so crass. And in fact, I found myself admiring the fact that he was able to take such a traumatic and intense part of his life and transform it into something beautiful, magical even. But it seems that even during his harrowing escape, he realized just how spectacular it was and what a good story it would make later. The fact that he planned a song to sing for the moment that he was released, that reminded me a lot of Buffalo Bill. I found myself thinking, wow, here's someone who's using that showman's toolkit that we've seen so many times on this show, but applying it to a good cause. Anyway, like I said, this is kind of a loose idea, but thanks for letting me sort of work it out loud on this bonus show. Now, before I dive into your questions about Box Brown and about Snow White, I want to take a look back at our last trilogy and the Viking voyages to North America. After I released the last bonus show where I was specifically answering questions about that series, I got a great email from a listener in Iceland. And I thought it was really important that we hear an Icelander's perspective on all of this. So this comes from our Icelandic listener, Gardar. Gardar writes, "Hi, Sebastian, longtime listener here. This is the second time I write you, and I just realized that for the second time, I'm too late for the special episode. I'm Icelandic and was greatly exposed to the sagas and stories about Eric the Red and Leif Erikson growing up. I loved your recent episodes on the Norse presence in North America, and so I compiled a little list of comments and questions for you. Even though I missed the Q&A episode, I thought I'd send you my thoughts anyway. Do with them what you will. First, the comments. 1. I think you'll get a kick out of this. In modern Icelandic, the word saga simply means story, but it is also the word we use for the field of history. I'm sorry to say that, as far as I'm aware, there are no statues or memorials for Thorfinn Karlsefni in Iceland, although I believe there is one in Philadelphia. I also thought you should know that the moniker Karlsefni translates roughly as man material, or perhaps the potentially manly. I do like that. I really got a kick out of your Justice for Bjarni bit. Growing up, I had a VHS tape of an animated movie about Leif Erikson where Bjarni Herjolfsson is not portrayed as a coward. He is the primary antagonist. That man really has been done dirty. Here are the questions. 1. It seems to me that the contrast between the characters of Gudrid and Freydis may have been intended as a further contrast between Christianity and paganism. Gudrid is a Christian name, Gud meaning God, while Freydis is a pagan name, literally meaning maiden of Freyr, as in the pagan god of fertility. It's also interesting to me that in the later Saga of the Greenlanders, Freydis has some more epic, heroic moments. See the breast slap with the sword. Maybe when those sagas were written, the writers were less worried about presenting pagan qualities as purely negative because by their lifetime, Christianity was already fairly entrenched. Any thoughts? 2, I was surprised to hear that some scholars suggested Vin could actually be in reference to grasslands. In modern Icelandic, Vin means oasis, as opposed to Vin, which means wine. Is the idea that pleasant grasslands were kind of an oasis for the Norse? I had also thought about the settlement of Hope. In Icelandic Norse, the word for hope is von, suspiciously close to Vin, right? And 3, I find it interesting that in the quest to find the real Vinland, people are so ready to accept the descriptions of Leif of the absolute paradise, with wild grapes and all that. This is the guy whose dad came up with the name Greenland to trick people into migrating. It seems to me like the name Vinland could just be Leif trying that same trick one step further. Any thoughts on this? Anyway, I know I'm too late in sending these in, so feel free to ignore them. In any case, love the show, keep up the good work, and feel free to reach out if you ever want an Icelander's perspective. Best regards, Gardar. Okay, thank you so much for that very thoughtful email, Gardar, and I hope I have pronounced your name somewhat close to how you would pronounce it. It's a tricky one. So let's go through this. First, yes, I do love the fact that in Icelandic, saga means both story and history. I love that baked into that language is the concept of fake history. I find it fascinating that the only statue of Thorfinn Karlsefni that you could track down was in Philadelphia. I think that underscores just how much Americans got into the idea of early Norse arrivals in the 19th century. Americans became more enthusiastic about the North American Vikings than even the Icelanders, potentially. And yes, I will say it again, justice for Bjarni. He does not deserve to be the villain in that particular fondly remembered VHS that you had. Now, as for your questions, I loved your insight about the meanings of the names Gudrid and Freydis. I really think there's probably something to that. Gudrid's name suggests Christianity, Freydis's name suggests paganism, and I think your theory that the later sagas, the saga of Eric the Red, not the saga of the Greenlanders, as you said in your email, is a bit more sympathetic to Freydis because Icelanders were less concerned about paganism. I think that's a good idea. I don't know if we can prove that, but I think that's a great insight, and I'm gonna chew on that one. Next, I love that you pointed out that in modern Icelandic, the word vin means oasis. I think that gives a whole other perspective on what the Norse potentially meant when they called a place Vinland. Could a grassland have been an oasis for the seafaring ancient Norse? Quite possibly. But as we learned in the last bonus episode, the word hope, spelled H-O-P with an accent on the O, refers specifically to tidal pools, which is why some scholars believe that an area in New Brunswick is likely the site of Hope because there are tidal pools there. And to answer your last question, yes, we should be incredibly skeptical of the family that gave us Greenland. Right? Of course we should. I didn't bring that up on the main episode, but, clearly these ancient Norse explorers were naming places in a way that would hopefully drive migration. So is that something that could have happened in the case of Vinland? Totally. It definitely could have. Anyway, thank you again for your email. It did come in late, but I had to read it because the perspectives of an Icelander are so important to this story. And I just love that there are people listening to this podcast in Iceland. Shout out to all my Icelandic listeners. I hope to visit you one day. Okay, pivoting to some questions about Henry Box Brown, we are going to go to Patreon. This one comes from a patron named Alex. Alex writes, I find it interesting that in order to rehabilitate Henry Box Brown's later career, people feel the need to frame him as an activist, as if simply being a performer isn't enough. No, he must be interpreted as pushing boundaries all the time. Is this because we expect the reverse path from our entertainers and artists? Nowadays, you first gain fame as an actor/entertainer/performer, and this gives you a platform to speak out on society and politics. Box Brown used his activism as a launching platform for a circus show. So, is it okay to go from entertaining to serious, but not the other way around? Thanks for that question, Alex. That one really gave me something to think about. Do we have more empathy for an entertainer who becomes political as opposed to a political figure who becomes an entertainer? I would guess that the reason that we feel more uncomfortable with the idea of an activist transitioning into life as a magician and a circus type performer is because it makes it seem like that earlier activism may have somehow been insincere or just another part of their show. I also think that in the specific case of Box Brown and other people who had escaped slavery, there was this feeling that they needed to perform their trauma in a very specific way. Abolitionists who were making the case that slavery was an evil and immoral institution found it easier to point to people who had been obviously scarred and traumatized by that experience. Now, if you had a survivor who was particularly joyful and had a sense of humor and a sense of play the way that Henry Box Brown did, the worry was that slavery apologists could point to them and go, well, this person seems fine. Maybe slavery isn't so bad after all. Look, Henry Box Brown's out here doing magic tricks. Clearly, slavery didn't affect him all that much. Now, of course, that's a ridiculous perspective, but it is the kind of thing that people would say. In many ways, this is what I found to be the most fascinating aspect of the Henry Box Brown story. To be a truly free person is to be able to express yourself in all the weird ways that you want to express yourself. There's no doubt that Box Brown likely felt a lot of pressure to perform his story in a way that was more modest, more serious, more somber, more in keeping with the church service like abolitionist meetings that they would typically do. But what I admired about him so much is that he wasn't constrained. He wanted to put on a very specific type of show, and he did it. And I believe that he did it knowing what the reaction would be, understanding that there would be pushback, understanding that people would try and use his showmanship against him. So, Alex, yes, I think you're totally right that there is a different way that we perceive activists turned entertainers versus entertainers turned activists. And one thing I love about the Henry Box Brown story is that he was not constrained by that perception. Our next question from Aaron on Patreon is very closely connected to what we were just talking about. Aaron asks, was there an instinct in the abolitionist movement to be serious and somber, not just because they were fighting a horrific practice, but also because they did not want to be associated with anything resembling minstrel shows, as I presume they would most likely play in the same venues and follow a similar tour/lecturing route? Aaron, great question. You folks are incredibly perceptive. Yes, this was a concern of the abolitionists of the day. For those that don't know, minstrel shows were a very popular form of entertainment that got started in the early 19th century and continued on into the early 20th century that involved the performance of African American stereotypes. The performers in these shows often wore blackface and exaggerated their features to turn themselves into hurtful caricatures of black people. In the mid-19th century, these shows involved a lot of musical numbers and comedy routines that basically soft-pedaled the horrors of slavery. These shows basically made plantation life seem like it was a big joke. And we know that the vulgar stereotypes used in minstrel show performances had a way of lingering on in American and European entertainment well into the 20th century and beyond. Now, as you might expect, many abolitionists were deeply opposed to minstrelsy and minstrel shows in general. Many have pointed out that the famous black abolitionist Frederick Douglass never really smiled when he posed for photographs. This was done specifically as a rejection of the types of stereotypes that were prominent in minstrel shows. A huge part of his activism and his visual performance of that activism was a sort of anti-minstrel pose, which was entirely understandable. So, Aaron, yes, you are correct that there was an anxiety that Henry Box Brown's style of performance was perhaps a little too minstrel adjacent. Now, one thing that was incredibly challenging was that in the mid-19th century, it was hard to be a black entertainer doing something that was at all lighthearted without being compared to a minstrel show. So, Aaron, yes, you are quite right to point out that many abolitionists really wanted to keep their distance from anything resembling minstrelsy, and Box Brown's embrace of musical numbers and spectacle certainly made people nervous. The interpretation that I brought to that Box Brown episode was deeply affected by the scholarship of Daphne Brooks and her amazing book, Bodies in Descent. Brooks made a very convincing case that even the parts of Box Brown's performances that could seem a bit more frivolous were in themselves emancipatory. By defying convention, even those conventions adhered to by abolitionists, he was truly presenting himself as a free person. And so I encourage everyone to check out the work by Daphne Brooks and by Martha Cutter, whose work on Box Brown is exemplary. Okay, let's turn our attention to some comments that came in regarding the Snow White episode. Many of you wanted to talk about my introduction about the Mandela Effect. One listener reached out through Blue Sky and pointed my attention to YouTube and a creator there who goes by the Nostalgia Nerd. The Nostalgia Nerd has done an excellent video breaking down the Mandela Effect and explaining really how it functions. After watching that video, it became clear that many of my intuitions about the Mandela Effect had in fact been supported by scientific studies, so I encourage you to go check that out. But one really important piece of information that I got from that video that I did not know was that part of the reason why people believed that Nelson Mandela died in the 1980s in prison was because there was a misinformation campaign orchestrated by Nelson Mandela's enemies, which planted false stories in newspapers that he had died. There were also tons of rumors while Mandela was still imprisoned that he was sick or on the verge of death or about to die. The point is that there was a lot of chatter in the 1980s about Nelson Mandela potentially dying while he was imprisoned. So this might explain where this false memory came from. Now, I am still skeptical of the idea that thousands upon thousands of people had this shared false memory, but if you search the internet, you will find many seemingly sincere commenters claiming that they also believed that Mandela had died in the 80s. So those false news stories and exaggerations in the press might help explain where that idea came from. While we're on the topic of the Mandela Effect, 4Color PJ on Patreon asks, first off, in regards to the Kazaam movie, I always wondered who was the ticket sale for that movie. And now I know. Yes, it was me. Then later in the comment, 4Color PJ asks, what's your favorite Mandela Effect? I still have to go with the Darth Vader quote or the Star Trek one. Well, my friend, this one is sort of tricky for me to answer because I don't think I have a favorite example of the Mandela Effect because, as you probably gathered from my introduction, I think the Mandela Effect is kind of silly. Or, more specifically, I think that all the examples of the Mandela Effect can be very easily explained. And the fact that we have this schmancy title, the Mandela Effect, has elevated them to a level that perhaps they need not be elevated to. But if I was to pick a favorite, then of course it has to be Sinbad in the role of a lifetime as Shazam. I think that's funny because genie movies are kind of funny to me, and even funnier is the fact that a real movie with Shaquille O'Neal as a rapping genie actually exists. The fact that people have tried to edit Shaquille O'Neal out of that movie in their memories is very funny to me. It just is so incongruous to them that basketball great Shaquille O'Neal would be in a rapping genie movie that they're like, no, it had to be Sinbad. So for sure, that's my favorite of them. Next, David from Patreon has some very helpful information about the alleged talking magic mirror that is kept in the Spessart Museum in northern Bavaria. David writes, Speaking magic mirror. The speed of sound is well known, so it's easy to calculate how far a sound reflector must be from the listener given the delay in hearing the echo. Since using a mirror would require standing very close to it, any echo it produced would return in such a short time as to be indistinguishable from the original speech. Physics equals myth busted. Thank you, David. I appreciated that comment because I was very skeptical of the idea that that mirror was a talking mirror. Also, I was finding all sorts of contradictory stuff when I was researching that particular artifact in the Spessart Museum. Now, it was really difficult because a lot of the sources were in German and I could not read them. The stuff that I found written in English sometimes said that it was a talking mirror because it reflected so clearly that it always told the truth, or that it had some sort of audio trickery involved in it that created this echo. But those sources were so poor that I felt like I had to give all sorts of caveats in the episode. David, thank you for pointing out what should have been obvious to me, which is the speed of sound. But, I'm not a great mind for physics, so I'm glad that some of you out there listening were like, well, obviously this could not be a real thing. So I appreciate that, David. Thanks for writing that. Our next comment comes to us via email from Andy. Andy writes, Hi, Sebastian. I was recently told about your podcast by one of my colleagues, and I've been really enjoying the series. I listened to the latest Snow White episode this week, and I was intrigued about the potential for Snow White being the unfortunate Margareta von Waldeck. One thing that put me in mind of the dwarves in the legend was the presence of dwarves as attendants in the Hapsburg court as recorded in the painting Las Meninas, and that might provide a link. Keep up the great work and enjoy your trip to Greece. Cheers, Andrew. Thanks so much for that very kind email, Andrew. I loved your point about that famous painting. For those who do not know the painting that Andrew is referencing there, it's a famous portrait of the Hapsburg royal family that was done by Diego Velázquez. Diego Velázquez was a very famous Spanish painter who worked in the court of King Philip IV of Spain. As you might remember from the Snow White episode, King Philip II was a key player in that story. Apparently, Margareta von Waldeck had captured the heart of the Crown Prince Philip II, and that is why, presumably, she was rubbed out by Hapsburg agents looking to preserve Philip's marriage alliance with Queen Mary of England. Philip II would have been the grandfather of Philip IV. Now, we know from these Velázquez paintings that King Philip IV kept little people with dwarfism, at court as entertainers and as maids for his children. Las Meninas is probably the most famous painting that features some of these little people who served at the Spanish court. But Velázquez did a whole series of portraits of court performers, including a number of people who had dwarfism. So, Andy is throwing out the idea here that maybe dwarves came into the Snow White legend because of the connection to the Hapsburg court, where, if the example of Philip IV is any indication, there may have been people with dwarfism acting as entertainers or servants, or who may have been around Margaretha von Waldeck. Now, I don't think we can really prove that, but it's a great idea, Andrew, and I loved the connection to art history. The final comment today comes from someone who wrote me from where I live right now, here in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. It's always nice to hear from my neighbors. Karen says, "Hi, I'm a new listener and really enjoying the podcast. So interesting and engaging. My question is about the real Snow White. How did you resist the temptation to refer to minor minors? Your willpower is exemplary. Best, Karen in Ottawa." Thank you so much, Karen. You must be new, because if you'd been listening for a long time, you would know that my willpower is often not exemplary. I often go for the pun when I see it there, and this time I resisted. Honestly, the episode about Henry Box Brown really had me fighting all sorts of references to, thinking outside of the box. I really had to stop myself. I also thought it might be a little grim to make a bad pun about people whose bodies had been stunted because of underage labor in pre-industrial mines. So, I held back that time, but don't get used to it. I'm getting on in years, and I'm really starting to embrace my dad joke era. So, brace yourself. There's more coming. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 1 week's time when we'll have an all-new episode of Our Fake History for you. In the meantime, never hesitate to reach out to me. Like I said at the top of the episode, I love hearing from you. If you want to be a patron, go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. Find a level of support that's going to work for you. The next extra episode is very close to being finished. I am toiling away on it, so you will not have to wait much longer to get that if you are a patron. But also, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. Email's probably the best way to get me if you're not a patron. I'm also on Facebook, though, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. And hey, if you're not following along on Instagram, go check out the Instagram. The Instagram's really fun. We've got all the amazing art that is created for the show by Frank Fiorentino up there, and all the fun little videos that I'm creating to promote the show as well. So if you want to see what my ugly mug looks like, head on over to the Instagram, check out Frank's beautiful art and my ridiculous face. One totally free way that you can support this show is just by telling someone you think would dig it. I really believe that there's still a place in this world for word of mouth. So if you've got a friend who is into history, who listens to a lot of podcasts, then maybe suggest Our Fake History to them. They might just enjoy it. Okay. As always, the theme music for this show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
Thousands of free movies and TV shows.
We're coming at you with everything we got.
This is the mindset. Free. This is the mantra.
Free.
This is the mindset. With movies like Pineapple Express, the entire Star Trek film franchise, and Gladiator, and TV shows like Survivor, SpongeBob SquarePants, The Fairly Odd Parents, and Ghosts, Pluto TV is always free. Huzzah! Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.